Most filmmakers are still trying to solve the wrong problem. For 100 years, the hardest part of cinema was making the film. That problem is now mostly solved. Today, almost anyone can make a film, and that changes everything. Because when production becomes easier, attention becomes the real battleground. So if you making the film is no longer the bottleneck, then what is? In the next 20 minutes, I'm going to show you the 5 shifts that moved the value somewhere else. And by the end, you will understand why the future of cinema doesn't belong to the people who simply make films. It belongs to the people who build systems. Before we go further, let me make this very clear. This is not just about film. This is about any creative business built on attention, capital, and trust. If you are a filmmaker, producer, founder, creator, or investor, the same shift is already affecting you. And if you understand it early, you will build differently than everyone else. Let's start with the first shift. For most of film history, production was the bottleneck. Could you get the camera? Could you get the crew? Could you get the money? Could you get the theater? Could you get the distribution? That scarcity gave value to the people who could overcome it. But today, that world is gone. A filmmaker with a modern camera, editing software, cloud collaboration, and global communication can now do what once required an entire studio. That is a huge creative victory. It opens the door for voices that would never have been heard before. But every victory creates a new problem. The easier it becomes to produce, the harder it becomes to be discovered. The more stories enter the market, the harder it becomes for any one story to stand out. Production is expanding, attention is not. That is the new reality, and it changes the rules. Because now your film is not only competing with other films, it is competing with everything else trying to capture a human mind. A football match, a podcast, a creator on YouTube, a reel, a game, a text message, a notification. A film is no longer competing only inside cinema. It is competing inside the entire economy of attention. And that means the real question is no longer, can I make this? The real question is, can people find it, trust it, and choose it? That leads to the next shift. Because when you understand attention, you realize something else. The film is not the whole business. It is only part of much larger design. Most people think of a film as one product, one finished work, one thing to sell. But that is not how the business actually works. A film is really a collection of rights, and each right has its own value, timing, and strategy. So the real question is not who will buy my film. The better question is which rights should I keep, which should I license, and when. Because ownership and licensing are not the same thing, and that difference can decide the future of the project. This is where the business gets serious. A producer is not just delivering a film. A producer is designing rights architecture. Like an architect designing a building, you decide where the value enters, where it pauses, where it grows, and where it moves next. Some producers license everything immediately. Others keep certain rights for future opportunity. Neither is automatically right. It depends on the project, the market, the investors, and the long-term strategy. But the point is this: strategy exists. And once you see the film as architecture, you stop thinking only about release. You start thinking about windows, territories, exclusivity, and future optionality. Then another hiding layer appears: money. Most people ask how much a film made. That is not the most useful question. The real question is, how did the money move? Because revenue is only the headline. The structure behind it is what decides who actually wins. That is why experienced investors study structure, not just story, because structure determines outcomes. And if structure determines outcomes, then the next question becomes unavoidable. If the audience is not just the end of the business, then what are they? The answer changes everything. For decades, the audience was treated as the final destination. You made the film, you released it, and then you hoped people would find it. That made sense in an older distribution world, but that world is gone. Now the audience is not the end of the business, it is the beginning. I call this audience capital because an audience is not just a list of viewers, it is accumulated trust, and trust behaves like capital. It compounds, it opens door, it makes the next conversation easier than the last one. Two producers finished similar film, same budget, same quality, same level of ambition. One starts every project from zero, zero followers, zero trust, zero momentum. The other has spent years building relationship, sharing ideas, and making people care about the bigger vision. When the new film arrives, that producer is not introducing themselves. They are continuing a relationship. That difference is invisible on paper, but it changes everything in practice, because a film that enters the market alone is fighting uphill. A film that enters a community already waiting for it has momentum, and momentum itself becomes an asset. This is why marketing has to be rethought. Marketing is not just something you do 2 weeks before release. It is not a trailer drop. It is not paid campaign. Audience capital is built over time, through consistency, through credibility, through real value. Every post, every conversation, every interview, every festival moment, every newsletter, every insight that helps people understand your world. Those are not random actions. They are deposits, not into one film, into the ecosystem around all future films. And once you understand that, you begin to see why creators, filmmakers, and producers who build trust consistently are able to move differently. Because in a world of infinite supply, attention follows trust, and trust cannot be rushed. Which brings us to the next shift. Technology is not the threat most people think it is. The real issue is how you use it. Every major technology enters the industry as a threat. Sound, color, digital cameras, non-linear editing, streaming. Each one was treated as disruption before it becomes standard. Artificial intelligence is doing the same thing now, but most people are asking the wrong question. They ask, will AI replace filmmakers? That's the wrong question. The better question is, what becomes possible because AI exists? Because filmmaking is not just storytelling, it is also operations, research, scheduling, versioning, metadata, localization, subtitle, audience analysis. rights management. Those tasks do not replace creativity, but they consume time. And time is one of the only resources you never get back. So, AI is not just a creative tool, it is a leverage tool. And leverage is powerful because it lets small teams do what once required much larger organizations. Not because people matter less, because repetitive friction becomes cheaper. One team spends months doing work that machines can now accelerate. The other uses that time for what only human can do well: strategy, negotiation, creative direction, relationship, leadership. That is the real advantage. Not replacing humans, placing humans where they matter most. But there is another side to this: trust. Because AI is not only about capability, it is also about responsibility, authorship, consent, training data, provenance, transparency. These are not small details. They are the foundation of future trust. And without trust, innovation slows. With trust, innovation scales. So the question is not whether AI belongs in the workflow. It does. The question is whether you are using it to create more value or just more noise. Because technology can multiply your clarity or multiply your confusion. And that leads to the final shift. If the bottleneck has moved, if rights are architecture, if audience is capital, and if AI is leverage, then what is the producer actually building? Not just a film, something much bigger. The next generation of producers will not think project by project. They will think in systems, in sequences, in portfolio. Because a film has a release date, but a business has a future. Career has momentum. An ecosystem keeps growing long after one project ends. That is why the strongest producers don't ask only, "What am I making?" They ask, "What am I building?" Those are completely different questions. A film can succeed once, a system can succeed repeatedly. And that is what changes the business model, because every project becomes part of a longer chain. One project attracts collaborators, the next attracts investors, the next strengthens trust, the next opens international doors, the next expands the brand. Momentum becomes an asset, and sustainable careers are not built from isolated wins. They are built from deliberate accumulation. This is why the producer's role is changing. The modern producer is not just someone who finances and delivers films. The modern producer is an ecosystem builder, someone who connects creative talent, audience trust, rights, technology, partnerships, capital, reputation. When those things reinforce each other, the world system becomes more valuable than any single film inside it. That is the portfolio mindset, and it is what separates short-term activity from long-term power. So, let me give you one final framework. I think of sustainable cinema through 4 capitals. Creative capitals, the idea and voice. Business capital, the structures and deals. Audience capital, the trust and relationships. Intellectual property capital, the stories and worlds that can keep growing. These 4 do not exist separately. They strengthen one another. Creative excellence attracts attention. Attention becomes trust. Trust improves business. Business protects IP. IP creates more creative possibility. That cycle is the real engine. And it is why the future belongs to producers who think like long-term builders, not in the narrow sense of money alone, in the deeper sense of legacy. Every generation believes it is living through unprecedented change. Most of the time, it is not. But sometimes an industry reaches a point where the rules themselves begin to shift. That is what is happening now, not because stories matter less, because the system around stories has changed. The bottleneck moved. For most of cinema's history, the challenge was making the film. Today, making the film is only the beginning. The real challenge is designing everything that let the film keep creating value. That is why the future does not belong only to better filmmakers. It belongs to better builders. Builders of audiences, builders of trust, builders of partnerships, builders of institutions. Because creativity without structure struggles to endure, and structure without creativity has nothing worth sustaining. The future belongs to the people who can do both. So if you've been asking yourself what this industry is becoming, this is the answer. Cinema is no longer just an art. It is an economy, an ecosystem, an attention business, a leadership business, an intellectual property business, and above all, a human business. Because every contract, every partnership, every platform, every strategy, every technology still exists for one purpose: to help meaningful stories find the people they were made to reach. That is the business of cinema. My name is Ellen Voss, and I believe the next generation of producers will not be remembered for making the most films. They will be remembered for building the strongest creative ecosystems, because they understood one thing: a film is never the finish line. It is the beginning of a much larger journey. If this changed the way you think about film, business, or creativity, send it to one person who is building something meant to last longer than a single release. This is Abolite Channels, where we don't just talk about how films are made. We talk about how the future is built.